Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. Tonight we're going to attack a very difficult and probably very long-winded subject, and that's the subject of illicit drugs. Now, illicit drugs are just an incredibly broad and topic that I could literally put an entire podcast out over just to discuss the concepts, the ins, the outs, the ups, the downs, the backs, the forwards. It's just so complicated, so just extensive. But how it overlaps with the Great Montana Conspiracy is still a critical component because it represents the financial backbone of much of what Montana relies upon to fund its illicit behavior. Where money comes in to support, it's what motivates these people to stay in their positions of power and authority, their influence, their elitism, all these other topics we've talked about. And before I proceed, please, if you're watching this video on YouTube, please like and subscribe. The more people that like, the more people that follow, obviously, the more exposure we get. And as always, I'll remind you again at the end of the podcast to help support our efforts here. Now, we already talked about considerably things like propaganda, brought up in several different podcasts, even had on the topic of propaganda. Let's look at a real life example. Let's look at how the state addresses and modifies the perception of drug use. And particularly I'm talking about illicit drug use. And that includes prescription drug abuse, illicit drugs such as heroin, cocaine, etc. And of course, in many states, marijuana. As of the 1st of January, Montana is actually legalizing marijuana. That's another topic for another issue entirely about how the state's profiting off of that. But let's put that aside for just a moment. Roughly 15% of all arrests each year amount to deal with drug violations. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, but when the other categories are broken down, drug violations actually are the largest category. 15% of all types of offenses, drug violations are up there. In 2020, 1,155,610 arrests in the United States for drug laws. That's from the FBI's annual statistics. 86.7% of those possessions, or percent of those arrests were for possession, which means they had some. They had, whether it be actual drugs or they had residue, possession. Only 13.3% of these arrests were for sale and distribution or manufacturing. Which means if you just barely split that down the middle, less than a single percentage point is responsible for production, and less than a single percentage point is responsible for sale and distribution of drugs. In other words, the vast majority of drug violation offenses that are prosecuted every year are not attacking the infrastructure of the drug industry. They are attacking the victims of the drug industry. And I specify victims. Addicts are victims in most cases. They are people, common people, good people who have become addicts, and the drug industry preys on them, whether it be the legal pharmaceutical companies or it be the illegal, supplier out there on the street. The people who are addicts suffer from a medical need and a medical condition, and they are victims of the drug industry. And the government punishes victims. I can't make that clearer. The government punishes these victims by a vast majority. 86.7% of arrests from drug violations in 2020 were for possession, just having something on them. And the reason why I bring this up as a subject of propaganda is because drug arrests are perceived through propaganda, through the media, through TV shows and everything else, to be violent conflicts. You go to arrest someone with drugs, they draw a gun, they shoot on you, they do this big chase, they do... That's just not it. There might be a small percentage of cases that are like that, but the vast majority are just people who happen to have something on them when they're pulled over, or they get frisked down, or there's a circumstance where an officer says, "Turn out your pockets," and the person does. They just have possession. No violence, no guns, no anything, just possession. Non-violent, non-relatable, and it's not what the media and everybody has you believe. The vast majority of offenses are for possession alone, just possession. If the majority of arrests are not even attacking the infrastructure of the drug industry, they're simply attacking the people who are victimized by drug abuse and by their own addictions, what's the point? Why do we have laws outlawing drugs if the government isn't focusing on the actual structure of the industry? And the reason? Money. The bottom line, and I'll get into the details of this in quite a bit of detail here. The bottom line is that the government makes a hellacious amount of money off the drug prosecution industry. A hellacious amount of money. And if they shut down the drug industry, they lose that constant incoming revenue. And that's what it is. It is revenue. It is money. It's part of their budget. They actually count on that money. And if they shut down the industry entirely, then they lose that source of revenue. And that's the bottom line. And I'm going to explain that in detail in this podcast. In the United States, for anybody who's not here, who might be out somewhere else out in the world, who might be watching this podcast, both nicotine, in other words, cigarettes, and alcohol are legal. Both have demonstrated highly addictive properties with significant health side effects. Smoking is well known for cancer, emphysema, and heart disease, amongst many other side effects and problems. Drinking is known for liver failure, brain disease, and pancreatitis, again, amongst a host of other problems. These are regulated and overseen by the federal government, yet they are legal. So ponder the question, why not illicit drugs? Why not marijuana in all states? Why not methamphetamines? Why not cocaine? Why not heroin? Regulate them, control them, put them under government supervision so the quality is there, the licensing necessity is there, and then control the addiction side effects the same way you deal with alcohol and nicotine. Let me be crystal clear right up front here. I don't use drugs. I've never used drugs. I don't like side effects of prescription medications. I can't perceive the need for something more illicit. But this is a choice, not a judgment. I'm not in any manner, shape, or form judging addicts. In fact, I ran an adult sobriety program for several years. I also do not smoke and drink, by the way. I don't smoke cigarettes, marijuana, anything. I don't drink. Again, it's a choice. It's not a judgment. I have many friends who do all the above. I don't care. It's not my concern. So unless their issue, whether it be alcohol, cigarettes, or otherwise, becomes a health risk. I have a friend who smokes cigarettes. He's got emphysema. He can't breathe. And he wants me to buy him cigarettes. I'm saying, no, you can't breathe. You can't go get cigarettes on your own. I'm not going to contribute to that. Because at that point in time, I'm contributing to his self-harm. At the point that an addiction, whether it be to a legal substance or an illegal substance, becomes a health issue, that's when I think government has a responsibility to step in and supervise, not criminalize. Simply step in for the welfare of the citizens. Cancer, whether it be addiction, whether it be whatever. It is an underlying health issue in our country, and the government has a responsibility to address the health aspect of it, not the criminal aspect of it. The pursuit of drug offenses is part of the over-criminalization of our justice system, which I have talked about in previous episodes. This needs to be an addiction treatment issue, i.e. a health issue, not a criminal issue. The production of illicit drugs, the distribution, sale of illicit drugs, certainly. You're talking about illicit production of a controlled substance. You're talking about distribution through means that are not regulated but through government oversight. Yeah, those issues are a concern, but they're only consisting of 13.3% of our prosecution in 2020. So what the vast majority of people that are going to prison, they're going to jail, they're facing consequences in the legal system are not the people creating the problem. They're the victims of the problem. This needs to be dealing with their addiction as a medical treatment. We treat alcoholism mostly as a medical need, with the exception of DUIs or DWIs, which, clarification for anyone who's not in America, DUI and DWI are basically the same thing. They're just different terminologies used in different states. DUI stands for driving under the influence, and DWI stands for driving while intoxicated. They're basically the same crime. You're operating a motor vehicle, and you are intoxicated. So, absent that, alcoholism is not a crime, and it's treated as a medical need and condition. Clinics exist to address both alcohol and nicotine addiction. They also exist to address drug addiction. However, there's a criminal component to drug addiction. So a person may check themselves in for drug addiction, but could also, in some states, actually face criminal prosecution if the subject of their treatment becomes public. Now, under what we call HIPAA laws here in the United States, those are confidential records. So the treatment facility itself can't release that information. That doesn't mean that family, friends, circumstances, situations might not report to law enforcement that this person has an addiction issue, is in treatment, and may lead to an investigation, which could eventually lead to criminal charges, because that's the way our justice system works. Hey, this person admitted he had a problem, he went to get treatment, and we're going to go ahead and use the fact that he went to treatment as the foundation to launch an investigation against him for criminal activity. Welcome to the United States. There's just no reason. There's just no reason why drugs should not be treated the same way as alcohol and nicotine. No reason whatsoever, without a criminal element. Again, distribution, manufacture, outside government regulation and oversight, fair game. The people who are victims here, the people who are the users, the ones who have developed an addiction, who have now a medical need as a consequence of their addiction, they shouldn't be treated as criminals. They should be treated as victims. It's agreed. Public intoxication is an issue, and I mentioned DWIs and DUIs. And protection of society is needed from those. But should someone in medical need from an addiction be criminalized? Should they be victimized further by our own justice system? And again, as many people know, I often put justice in quotes. Another factor to consider is the underlying cause of addiction. Whenever there is addiction therapy offered by government, it often becomes a cookie-cutter approach. In other words, everybody goes to the same program, they all go through group therapy, they all have homework assignments, they all do A, B, C to accomplish and get their certificate of completion and walk out of a government-sponsored treatment facility. Bottom line, cookie-cutter approaches do not work. It effectively leaves most addicts untreated because it does not address the underlying need they have for addiction or the underlying mental conditioning they've given themselves and other people in their group have given them to accept addiction as an okay. It's okay. It's all right. Such programs as group therapy and routine homework assignments simply do not work. They could work if they were incorporated with medication, individual cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's one-on-one, not group therapy, and job and housing assistance once they find themselves outside these programs. Basically, community safety net support. If there is an overlapping support system that exists beyond a treatment facility, the reason for recidivism reduces itself, because oftentimes the reason for recidivism when it comes to addiction is because hopelessness. You go to these treatment facilities, oftentimes you're going to lose your job, you may lose your home, you may find yourself in loss of everything just to go to treatment. When you get a treatment, you have nothing. You basically have nothing, and you're on the street and you're saying, what am I going to do? Hopelessness, despair lead to recidivism when it comes to addiction. A lot of the time, not all the time. It's not the only reason or the only cause. It is a big reason why people who go through treatment go back to drug use almost immediately, because they cannot deal with the hopelessness of the situation they now face. So a societal support is absolutely critical and necessary when you're talking about dealing with an addict or trying to deal with their response to being sober. But the problem is that individuals in pretrial detention centers receive absolutely no support, zero. And oftentimes they can be in pretrial custody for 3 months to 9 months, even a year or longer. I had a discussion, one of my earliest podcasts was on the subject of pretrial detention. An addict who comes into jail is forced to deal with withdrawals. They receive no medical or detox assistance. Studies show that immediate intervention is key to addiction recovery. In other words, within a few hours of being admitted, their need is assessed, they receive medical care, they receive proper detox requirements, just like you would in a medical wing. You are provided drugs, you are provided counseling, you are provided resources to deal with your addiction, because these people need it. Instead, what happens is they go through a very harsh trauma of withdrawal. Harsh, incredibly harsh. We're talking sick, we're talking body aches, chills, vomiting, fever, just delusions, and just complete agony for many of these people. And they're forced to go through it without any assistance whatsoever. It is completely inhumane. We're supposed to have an Eighth Amendment protection against cruel and unusual punishment. That's cruel and unusual, ladies and gentlemen. You take a person who has a physical addiction and a need to another substance, and you remove them from it entirely and force them to go through physical withdrawal without any assistance, without any humanity. That is cruel and unusual punishment, ladies and gentlemen. And it's done all the time. But the problem is that if left to detox without assistance, it roots belief in the addict of staying high. The bottom line is, if detox hurts, and it does, avoid it. Avoid hurt, avoid the pain. Go back and get high again as soon as possible, because that feels good. Detox sucks. The longer an addict is deprived of proper care, the more reticent to treatment they become. That's another problem. The longer this belief is allowed to root in their mind that detoxing is bad and getting high again is good, the more resistant they are to positive reinforcement of treatment. If they're given compassionate care upon entry into a facility, whether it be a jail or a hospital or wherever, the chances of them recovering from their addiction is improved significantly, because the negative trauma vanishes. It vanishes. You would actually have people wanting to be arrested to go through the proper detox process, because a lot of times being high is not all that great either. I'm not saying that every addict would line up outside the door and say, please arrest me, I want to get detoxed. But even 1 out of 100, 1 out of 50 is better than 0. Wouldn't you agree? If one addict walks in the door and takes advantage of that, isn't that a benefit? Isn't that a benefit to society? Aren't we in a liberal democracy? Isn't that supposed to be one of our issues? It's supposed to be the cornerstone of our issues. A liberal democracy is supposed to protect society. It's supposed to protect us from things that break down the fabric of society. If being civil and humane is not part of our society, then what is? Most offenders see jail time without any treatment. For those who are offered treatment, it's largely inadequate, especially in Montana. Montana-based treatment programs are the cookie-cutter approaches I discussed earlier. They are, let's do group therapy. Here's some homework assignments. Let's complete all these things. Let's walk in here. Let's talk about this. Let's do this in a group therapy session. And if you don't answer the way they want you to answer, you get ostracized. How's your treatment? How's that treating you? And especially if your approach to addiction has nothing to do with what everyone else in the room is. And there are so many different kinds of addiction and the reasons to go into addiction. A single cookie-cutter approach simply does not address it. Which is why one-on-one cognitive therapy is so critical. So critical. Not just, let's have a counselor meeting. Now let's just talk about a few things. I'm talking cognitive therapy. That's what we need. We need cognitive therapy for these people because they need to understand and need to come to grips with their issues. Whatever their underlying issue is for addiction. And everyone has one. Every addict has one. Everyone has a reason. It's either my life sucks, or I just like getting high, or I don't feel like myself if I'm not high, because they somehow coordinate being high with their natural state of existence, or the hallucinations are better than their reality. Whatever their reason. There's hundreds of reasons. That's why one approach doesn't solve the problem. Understand the root issues of addiction is so critical of this problem. It is paramount to understanding and addressing addiction. The reasons for addiction, they're just too numerous and impossible to address here. But let's take a look at one critical component, because it's going to deal with an aspect that, for my personal life, that recently has happened and, of course, has led to the subject of tonight's episode. And I'll talk about that personal issue in some aspect later in this podcast. But let's talk about one aspect that's really critically important to understanding this issue: opioid addiction. Opioid addiction in the United States has become a horrific problem. According to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, 10.1 million Americans misuse opioids every year. 10.1 million. 1.6 million of those are estimated to qualify as having opioid use disorder, i.e. addiction. States have been trying to rein in the opioid addiction. It's a hot button issue now in American politics. But the response that's been coming out of the states have not been adequate or properly addressed the underlying needs of the addicts. It only punishes them. And what do you do when you get punished when you're an addict? You don't stop being an addict. You find ways to avoid being punished. You hide what you're doing better. You don't stop. You just hide it better. Or you change your method of operation. Your modus operandi. You change it. You change it up. You try something different. You try a different approach. You try a new drug. You try a new supplier. You try a new way to do the drug. Whatever is necessary to accomplish the basic goal of the addict, which is to get high and to meet their expectations of what their addiction needs. Let us look at an example of someone in my own life. And this is the friend I mentioned. In all transparency, this person's addiction has led to a recent parting of ways. She decided that my unwillingness to watch her self-harm was reason enough to say she can't be in I can't be in her life. By the way, everyone say hello to Felicia, who decided to come here and say hi. Everyone remember my kitty cat? This is Felicia. I've introduced her before, but she decided she wants some attention. Over here, Felicia. Okay. So, once again, we have okay, let's just go ahead and put another aspect on the table. I live with chronic pain. This subject is going to talk about chronic pain. I have rheumatoid variant disease. Personally, I have a PRN for tramadol. In full disclosure, I rarely use it. I take a 10-pill prescription, and it can last me up to 6 months in good times. 3 months at the lowest. 10 pills. Whereas I could literally take it once a day and have it last 10 days, it lasts me much longer because I don't take it every day. I only take it when I absolutely positively cannot focus past the pain. I manage my pain with departmentalization skills that I've learned when I was young. And departmentalization is basically the concept of being able to choose to put thoughts and ideas in different parts of your mind, so you're not focusing them on in your main conscious attention. So by putting my pain into a different department and locking it away in another part of my consciousness, one that's not immediately aware, it allows me to not focus on it, and therefore I can function without pain pills. This is a largely untaught skill. Most people don't learn this skill. I learned it through martial arts. It doesn't mean that this is something that works for everybody. It works for me. And I think it would be a very effective method for a lot of people if it was actually taught, whether it be meditation, whether it be whatever. Alternatives exist to medication and pain relief. But not everybody has these skills. Not everybody is capable of understanding these skills. It may not work for everybody. I often mention I had an addict friend who said that AA made him Jones. It made him want to use because he's sitting around listening to all these other people talk about all their bad history with drugs, and all it makes him want to do is just go out and get high. So it doesn't do him any good to go through to an NA program or an AA program because it only makes him want to use. So my method of adaptation to pain doesn't always work for everybody, and I'm not endorsing it for everybody. I'm saying in all transparency, this is what I deal with. So I'm very familiar with chronic pain, and I'm aware of how debilitating it can be. Basically, I was given tools when I was younger to not need pills. And besides, I hate the side effects of these pills. I hate the side effects of anything that affects my consciousness. So whether it be alcohol or whether it be pharmaceutical drugs or whatever else, I hate the side effects. So I avoid them whenever I can. But that's, again, it's a personal choice. It's not a judgment, it's a choice. So my friend developed a chronic pain disease. And as I understand it, they've largely, as is very common with American doctors, they didn't spend a lot of time trying to diagnose it. Especially in our current market, the immediate response to her chronic pain was, let's prescribe her opioid painkillers. Of course, she developed a dependency, an addiction. But she also had boyfriends who were stealing her pills. So not only did she have a dependency and a reliance on these pills, and her reliance became greater than her prescription, she was also being deprived the very pills that her dependency counted on because her beaus were stealing her pills. So she began to farm for meds to fill her needs, which farming meds means you go from multiple doctors, multiple sources, try to get additional prescriptions. You go to the emergency room, you fake an injury, or you claim an injury so you can get more pain pills. You go to a private doctor, you go to another private doctor, you go to another hospital, maybe you drive between communities. You're farming for prescriptions. She got caught. She got found out. So as a consequence, she's been blacklisted. This is the solution that Montana has. If you get caught trying to solicit for multiple prescriptions of opioids, you are cut off from all opioids. You are cut off from all painkillers. Yet here's the problem. She still has an underlying medical need for which the opioids were prescribed. She still has the chronic pain disease. She still has the chronic pain that is accompanying. And by the way, for the record, I'm not mentioning a lot of specific details. I'm trying not to identify her. Okay? I'm deliberately choosing not to provide specifics. So if you think I'm being overgeneral, there's a reason. Okay, so just be clear on that. I'm not talking about specifics because I don't want someone to narrow down and say, okay, this makes it that person, therefore we're going to look at that person. I'm trying to avoid that by telling the story without providing the details enough to identify her. Okay? But anyway, Montana's response is, we're not going to address your medical need. We're going to cut you off from your medical need and in your ability to supply that medical relief because you now have an opioid addiction. You are now, in our mindset, a criminal. You haven't been prosecuted. You haven't gone to prison, but you have been punished because we have taken away the method you have to deal with your pain. Let's not put you through opioid treatment. Let's not put you through any kind of detox. Let's not try to find alternative therapy. Let's not try to deal with the underlying cause of your medical problem. Let's not test you. Let's not go through these efforts. Let's just cut you off. You now can no longer receive the medical care you need because you're an addict. You're an opioid addict. You're not prosecuted, you're not criminalized, and yet the state still punishes you, or in this case, punishes her. On the surface, to somebody who's heard propaganda about the drug and the opioid addictions, this may seem reasonable. Let's not feed the addict. Let's not give the addict any sympathy because they're addicts. But when you look deeper, what was done for her pain? Remember, she still had the underlying medical condition. She still had the need for those pain pills. The fact that she developed a dependency on those pain pills is irrelevant to whether she still had an underlying need for those pain pills. I mean, that's the critical issue here. Simply cutting her off from her addiction without treatment led to her searching for an alternative. And the solution she found was methamphetamines, also known as meth. Initially, to her credit, she was able to moderate her use, but eventually she lost control. She started using more heavily. She lost her daughter. She lost her basically her life, her family. She lost many things, but she couldn't completely kick it. She's been able to have brief periods of sobriety where she's walked away from it, tried to get clean, always fallen back. She's had periods of time where she's tried to reintegrate on a PRN basis or a per need basis, kind of like what I have with my tramadol, using it only when it gets so bad the pain gets so bad she can't deal with it. But inevitably, she falls back into heavy use. All because the state's solution to her addiction was to cut her off without any kind of treatment, without any kind of support, without any kind of network to try to deal, and just refusing to any longer deal with her underlying medical need because she developed an addiction to the very medicine that the doctors gave her. Thereafter, they just decided to ignore her underlying medical needs. The friend recently fell back into a serious binge 2 weeks ago. And during the course of this heavy binge, as I'm trying to sit here and support her and trying to get her to recognize that she needs to step back and try to see the harm she's causing herself, she developed a very serious abscess in her arm. And that abscess was massive. I'm talking probably like the size of a very large grapefruit under her arm. And she obviously needed medical care. She refused. Her fear of consequences, because she knew the medical doctors would know what she had been doing and how she got it. So she refused medical care. She insisted on self-treatment. And for a couple of days, when I first came and recognized the problem and tried to help her with it, she allowed me to drain it. She was sober. She didn't have any product to use. And as a consequence, she allowed me to treat it reluctantly, but nevertheless allowed me to treat it for a couple of days. Then she got a new supply, and that all went out the window. She stopped caring about how to treat it. In fact, she went a couple of days without treating it altogether. It just got worse, started eating away at her muscle tissue. You could see it. It was creating a big cavity in her arm below. And then she went, of course, at this point in time, she allowed me to look at it. She insisted on treating herself. And I sat there and had to watch her for 2 hours self-mutilate her arm as she sat there trying to pull at it, bruise it, trying to get to and she ignored all efforts to see the harm she was causing herself. And I had to walk away after 2 hours. After trying for 2 hours to try to convince her to let me take her to a doctor, to try to treat her myself, to try to do something besides what she was doing, to get her to stop doing what she was doing. Because in her hallucinogenic mind, she was convinced that she was an adult and she could cure her own arm, and she was causing massive harm. Now keep in mind, an abscess can lead to sepsis. It can lead to blood clots that can go up to your brain and kill you with a stroke. You can have blood poisoning. You can lose your arm. There's a number of consequences to leaving something like this untreated. An abscess is a collection of pus, foul-smelling, gross pus, gathering in a place in your body. It is an infection that needs to be treated. And it needs antibiotics. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be sterilized. Her fear of consequence of being criminalized was too great. Even though I told her that the doctors can't disclose this, it wasn't going to get reported to police, it wasn't going to be reported to anybody, she refused to go. Well, after that evening where I walked away after 2 hours, she cut off. She didn't respond anymore to texts, to phone calls. She didn't answer her door. I feared the worst. She's dealing with abscess that is literally life-threatening, and she could be dead in her room. Reluctantly, I was forced to call in the police to do a welfare check. At first, they weren't able to contact her. The concern remained. Later in the day, they were able to contact her and verify she was okay, but her reaction in the typical addict self-harm capacity was to say that she didn't want to have anything further to do with me. Not because I had been harmful to her, but because I wouldn't let her harm herself. And I was concerned that her self-harm would lead to something far more critical. But this is the addict's mentality. This is the way the addicts see their lives. They see people as people who want to harm them, or people who want to take advantage of them, or people who simply don't see the world as they do. And they think they're bulletproof. They think they're immune to any consequences or harm. And yeah, it hurts because I've invested a lot emotionally. I help a lot of people with their addiction issues. I've run an adult sobriety program. I've worked with as an AA sponsor in California. I've worked with addiction issues all over the map, all my life. My dad was a pothead. My stepfather was an alcoholic. I grew up with this. And I have tried to help throughout my entire adult life. The problem, however, is that at a certain point you have to recognize that you're powerless over someone else's choices. Yes, I was trying to get her back on her feet. Yes, she fell off the wagon. Yes, I was trying to be there for her to help her get back on the wagon, to encourage her in the right direction. She didn't want that. And ultimately, it was her choice to say she didn't want that help any longer. I'm not writing her off. I still will always hold hope that she will come back to a sane point of mind and realize the self-harm she's causing herself, and I'll be there for her. But at this point in time, I have chosen to step back. But the problem is that if she'd been treated properly at all stages, she wouldn't be at this point. Choosing self-harm over reasonable medical care. Had her addiction been properly addressed when it was first discovered, she would not have had to farm out for additional medication. Had the state not cut her off without any treatment to her underlying need, would she have ever had to experiment with meth? And in spite of major red flags where the law enforcement has seen evidence of her usage, I mean, I just called in a welfare check in which her arm having an abscess in it should have been a huge red flag. Government has continued to allow her to abuse. The question in all this is why? Why would the government see an addict, see somebody who has an obvious drug issue, a drug addiction, and not want to help them? The answer is for what the government gets out of this. The truth is, government makes massive profit off of the drug offense racket. And it is a racket. It's like your favorite lake. If you go out to your favorite lake and you love fishing for bass or whatever, crappie, I'm a fisherman, so forgive. Um, but you want crappie, you want bass, you want whitefish, pike, whatever. You go out to your favorite lake and you just go, oh, I just love this lake. And you fish and you fish and you fish. And you bring out all your friends and everybody just overfishes this lake. Pretty soon you're not going to have anything left in that lake to fish for, which means the lake is no longer your favorite lake and you're not profiting from being at that lake anymore. Right? If you overfish the water, there's nothing left to catch. At the end of the day, it serves the government more to keep addicts out in the community, especially in Montana. I can't speak for other states, but I can speak for Montana because I've witnessed it, and especially Kalispell because I've witnessed it here. Addicts breed. They share their stash with other people, with other addicts. They create more addicts. Untreated addicts will the majority of the time return to the drug of their choice. If they're arrested and released without treatment, they will return to being drug addicts. They will continue to breed other drug addicts. But statistics from dozens, if not hundreds of studies prove one central point. Comprehensive treatment from the first contact with an addict reduces recidivism. Let me repeat that. Comprehensive treatment from the first contact with an addict, when you first realize they are an addict, reduces recidivism, reduces return to addiction. Just as with any other disease, early detection and treatment is key. But when government sees addiction as a crime rather than a medical need and does nothing to treat it, it festers and it grows and it spreads. Just like COVID-19, just like the flu, it spreads. Additionally, the cost of comprehensive treatment and community support costs significantly less than the criminal justice system that's used presently to address this issue. A 2007 report from the National Drug Intelligence Center cites that there's $193 billion estimated cost of drug use, and just dealing with drug use in our society. $113 billion of that money is in the criminal justice costs and costs borne by victims. $113 billion of $193 billion. That's like 2/3, ladies and gentlemen. $80 billion is all that's left of that figure. That's not dealing with criminal justice. However, the same report cites that $14.6 billion is the estimated cost of treating drug use as opposed to criminalizing it. But of course, this means the government loses money. The government that relies on these budgets every year, that relies upon this money to come in to pay their various little fancy-dancy programs, their wages, their whatever, their club memberships, whatever their fancy projects are, that's it. They get money out of it. And they get money and they count that money, and the only way to count that money is to keep the problem there. Not to address it, not to treat it, not to properly attack the criminal element out there, the actual sales and distribution and the manufacturing component of the drug industry, but to attack the victims. And then they only filter out enough of the victims that they still keep the population healthy. Just like when you're fishing out of a pond, out of the lake, the example earlier, if you pull out just enough to allow to harvest just the right amount, you get to eat fish, and you allow enough fish left in there to breed for more fish. If you overfish the population, it'll be decades before the lake gets restored. But if you only pull out enough to keep yourself fed, then you have a lake that produces and continues to produce. And that's what the government has with the drug population. They allow criminals to exist out in our society. And I don't refer to addicts as criminals, because addicts, as I have said repeatedly in this podcast, are victims. But the criminals are the ones who are out there producing these without government oversight or regulation. And if the government simply legalized this, put it under an authoritarian flag, actually control the substances out there, control the distribution, control the marketing, control the development and the process, put regulations in there so you didn't get lace these things with chemicals that can be deadlier than the disease, than the addiction itself. You start controlling it, you start governing it, and you deal with the issues of people who overuse and become addicts appropriately, then the government no longer profits from this. And profiting is all this is about. At the end of the day, it comes down to greed over societal welfare. And remember, the principal purpose of a liberal democracy, and that's what we live under, is to protect and discourage, to protect society, to discourage and punish conduct that threatens civil society. So if the government response to illicit drugs is to become profiteers, is that genuine service? More importantly, does ignoring what is the best interest of society real liberal democracy? Is our government actually performing its function as a democratic government, or is it something else? Has it become big business? Has it become its own profitable corporation looking for profits every year and using poor victims to fund their 501ks? Got to change, ladies and gentlemen. And that's it for tonight's episode. I really appreciate you listening. By all means, if you have any questions, by all means, forward them to me. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you don't see a method to contact and support us, attach the video in whatever format you're watching this, please feel free to visit YouTube, look for the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast, or visit us on our original source, which is monspiracy.podbean.com. As always, I do hope that everyone out there is being safe, and whenever possible, please be free. Thank you.